Good morning to everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. I know we've had cold weather, hot weather, back to cold weather, typical Alabama winter. And was running a little behind this morning myself. It's amazing how, like, tomorrow, if I sit down and have a cup of coffee, the clock just moves slow as anything. But anytime I try to sit down on Saturday morning, I look up and I'm like, oh my goodness, I got to jump up and start getting ready. Put together a short little message that hopefully will be helpful to those listening today, and I titled it Being a Light to Others. And for those that are listening online, hello, and I see some new faces here today and some visitors, so it's good to see a lot of different people. If you've been watching the news lately, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that something is definitely wrong in our society. This past week, if you watched the news, you saw a lot of different things happening. You saw a Jewish group of people that were celebrating Hanukkah get attacked in Australia. You saw students attacked at Brown University, and evidently also a professor was also attacked. You saw a son who, as far as we can tell, and from what all the evidence leans to, it looks like a son who murdered his parents in Hollywood. And then locally, we had a murder-suicide of a young couple in Hoover, where when the police arrived, their 3-year-old child still in the house, all right. Thank God that the child was fine. But that's a terrible thing, because that 3-year-old child now is going to grow up with neither one of I don't know if it was a little boy or a little girl, but his or her parents. And you watch all these events, and those are just some of the things that we do know about that took place in the past week. And I'm sure there's many others. Mr. Morgan?
One more, but a killing in southwest Birmingham, off of that gas station. The suspect lived right across the street from my brother.
Oh, really?
In Dixon.
Yeah, so and there's probably a lot of stuff that takes place in Birmingham and suburbs that that we don't hear about. I know the one of the murder-suicide, that got a lot of press because the lady was a former newscaster, and something's definitely wrong in our society when you have these type things happening. But all of these things didn't begin last week, and they didn't begin last year or 2 years ago. If we're really honest with ourselves, all of these things began in the Garden of Eden. That's where it all began, where things started going not the way that God planned them to go when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. That's where it all starts from. And as time goes on, it continues to get worse, But don't forget, we look today and we see murder in our society, and we think things have evolved to this terrible state that we're at now. But it wasn't too far after Adam and Eve that their own son murdered his brother. So things, like I said, it didn't just recently begin. It began in the Garden of Eden. And so where does that leave us? Well, last week, Neil had a couple of messages where he spoke specifically about, being a Christian and also pursuing the way, not just being someone that professes Christ, but pursuing the way, right? And, we heard some different key phrases in that. I think one of them was one that Mr. Burleson had mentioned to Neil was, are you a disciple or are you a dabbler? And that was a really catchy phrase, but there was a lot of truth to it. And so I want us to start off by turning to John chapter 8, and just reading a short verse here. John chapter 8 and verse 12. And it says that Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. The one who follows me shall never walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Right? Will never walk in darkness, one that follows Christ, and will have the light of life, inside of them. And, that's a verse that should inspire us. If we make it our mission to follow Christ and his example, then our lives will be lights to others. It'll also be a light to ourselves. And we will be different from those of this world because we won't be walking in darkness. We won't be walking in darkness like we once were. At some point, we have all walked in darkness. Some maybe longer than others. And sometimes we've walked in darkness, came out of it, and went back into it, and come back out again. But we've walked in darkness before. But Christ has shown us the way, which Neil referenced in his message, to come out of darkness. He's shown us a path to the light. He's shown us a path to eternal life. And we should be very thankful for that. Because without Christ, we're doomed. We really are. Without him coming and living the life that he lived and giving his life for us, we are doomed. Well, let's go over to Ephesians. And in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 and begin in verse 8. And this is exactly what I said. We've all been in darkness at some point. But in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 8, we begin reading, For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light, because the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is well-pleasing to the Lord, and having no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather exposing them. Right? And so we see here, hey, we were once in darkness. That's not something up for debate. We were once in darkness, but now we've come into the light. And when we're moving towards that light, we should be experiencing the fruits of the Spirit. Right? Those are things that we should be bearing. But then also in verse 11, not continuing to have fellowship with the works of the darkness, but rather exposing them. Now, you can take that verse, some might read that verse, and take that to be their calling. Is to go into a synagogue, let's say, and flip tables just like Christ did, and expose the wrong things that are taking place in churches or synagogues or what have you. Some people could use this verse and say, that's exactly what I'm about to do. I'm about to get on Facebook and I'm going to start exposing people. Well, I look at that verse on a more personal level. And I don't look at it as a personal level that I need to go down to the local synagogue and flip the tables. That is, I'm coming into the light, and I should be examining myself. And that's something obviously that we talk more of as we move closer to Passover. But one of the things that is part of coming into the light is examining oneself. And that self-examining is exposing the darkness within myself. Okay? It's exposing that darkness within myself and casting light on it. That's exactly what self-examining oneself is, right? It's taking another look at yourself. And we don't really necessarily need to be concerned about what tables need to be flipped at this church or this synagogue or that congregation. What we really want to focus on are the tables that are in your temple that need to be flipped, right? Are the tables that are in you that need to be exposed. It's not about you or I exposing the world, their problems, but it's about finding our problems within and exposing them, right? And we think of the verse where it says, judgment starts with the house of Israel. And that has to begin with us examining ourselves. So we have plenty of tables that need flipping, but they're within our temples, our spiritual temples. Let's go over to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. And in Romans chapter 12, we're just going to read, begin in verse 1. In Romans chapter 12, we're going to begin in verse 1. And it says, I exhort you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and well-pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service. Okay, it's your duty. Do not conform yourselves to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, in order that you may prove what is well-pleasing and good, the perfect will of God. Now, offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. I've heard that a million times, right? To offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. And we often read this verse, but what does it really mean to be a living sacrifice opposed to just a sacrifice? You think about that. Christ came and gave his life as an actual sacrifice for the whole world. He was beaten and killed for all of us, right? Even those that haven't been born yet, and those that even went before him, you know. But he gave his life as an actual sacrifice. And in the Old Testament, we can turn to various verses that I didn't have written down, but we can see examples of a sacrifice being taken place. And they take a lamb, and that lamb is killed. And then they put the lamb on the altar, and they, burn it to God, right? It's a sacrifice. But when we are being called to be a living sacrifice, it's a little difference there, right? Because that lamb killed, put on the altar, prayers are said, it's burnt, but at some point that sacrifice is gone. It's gone, right? Now we're to be a living sacrifice, and why is that? Well, I think a big difference, and I shouldn't even say I think, a big difference between us and Christ is what? He was perfect and we're not. I mean, that's a really big difference, right? But that's a big difference between us and Christ. And we are definitely not perfect in all our ways, but he was. So our lives can't be thrown on an altar per se today and sacrificed. We just can't. Not to say that we can't give our lives for Christ, because there are some times, and in the Bible, where somebody might become a martyr, right? But my point is, if we're giving our lives as a living sacrifice, it's because as we walk in the way, as we begin to walk in the way and continue to walk in the way, and as we begin and continue to flip those tables that we find and expose in our temples, right? Something changes. We change. We evolve. We come to understand more, right? And as that happens, more of God's light comes into our lives. And that is that process of being a living sacrifice. It's an ongoing thing where we're growing, where we're changing, evolving, whatever word it is that you want to use there. But think about this. What is growing? What is changing? That is the definition of life, of living. And that's what a living sacrifice is. It's not a one thing, throw it on the altar. It's a process. And that's hopefully what we're doing in our lives is we're changing, we're evolving, we're coming to understand things better, flipping those tables, so to speak. And so, when you look at that, that's why, everybody's on different levels if there was a racetrack. But you can't even really compare it to a racetrack because I'm not competing with, this person or that person, right? If I'm competing with anybody, it's Christ. I'm trying to get to his level, right? but we're all on different places. Let's go to the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12. And so our process of becoming a living sacrifice is the process of having more of God's light coming into our lives and more of the darkness being expelled. And as that process takes place, we grow in grace, we grow in knowledge, we grow in understanding. We obviously grow in God's mercy, thankful for the various things that He's opened our eyes to. But in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, so then we read, it says, "So then, my beloved, even as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." And that's something that you and I should be doing and are doing, hopefully. "For it is God who works in you both to will and to do according to His good pleasure. Do all things without complaints and disputes." Do all things without complaints and disputes. That is one I could probably read it again, because that's very difficult. Israel struggled with that. We struggle with that, right? About doing the things that we should be doing that are for our own benefit, and we complain about it, right? "So that you may be blameless and without offense, innocent children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine as the light in the world." And in verse 16, "Holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, nor labored in vain. But if I am also poured out on the sacrifice of your faith, I am glad and rejoice together with you all." And in verse 18, "And in the same way also are glad and rejoice together with me." Christ knows that us living in this world that we live in, and if we're honestly trying to be a living sacrifice, that following the way isn't easy. It goes contrary to everything, right? It's just like trying to swim in the undertow in the ocean. It's running against the wind, all the various phrases you can come up with. It's not easy following the way. But notice we're given a warning in verse 14, and that's why I read it twice, against what? Complaining. Against complaining. If we keep the Sabbath, wonderful. But if you complain about having to keep it every week, right? Or if you complain about having to observe God's holy days, or if you complain about, not being able to work on the Sabbath and get that overtime or what have you, or giving up, or missing out on this job opportunity, that job opportunity, whatever it might be, we need to make sure, just as it says in verse 14, do all things without complaints and disputes. We need to make sure that we're not complaining about following the way. We know it's difficult. And if we complain about keeping the Sabbath or following God's way, then we're clearly still not seeing enough of the picture, right? We're still not seeing enough of the picture. God's way is the only way that leads us to light. There's not another way. There's not a shortcut. There's not another way. And it also leads to the fruits of the Spirit. It leads to a lot of blessings. It leads to longevity of life in many cases. When I say longevity of life, that doesn't mean if you see someone that's observing the Sabbath and trying to live their life accordingly and they die at age 30, I'm not talking about the longevity of this life necessarily. I'm talking about eternal life. Eternal life. God's way is the only way that leads to all of those blessings. And, the spirit is weak, right? The flesh is weak and the spirit, that's where we have to focus. We have to be going towards that pursuit. Let's go to 1 Peter. 1 Peter and chapter 2. 1 Peter in chapter 2. But we definitely want to be those that, as God shows us things, opens our eyes to things, that we act on it, but more importantly, that we don't complain about it. Because the more things that He opens your understanding to, the more things He opens your eyes to, He's also showing you His mercy. Because as He shows us more things, a lot of times that means these are things that we were doing incorrectly. And as He shows us how wonderful His mercy is, the last thing you want to do is start complaining about the thing that He showed you that you were doing wrong, that He gave you an opportunity to fix. God is a merciful God, for sure. But that doesn't mean we have to, or that we need to test that, so to speak. So 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, that's where we'll pick up. And it says, "But you are a chosen stock, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for possession of God, that you might proclaim His excellent virtues, who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light." So He's called us out of darkness. And not in this verse, not just into light, but to His marvelous light. And in verse 10, "Who once were not a people, but now are the people of God, who had not received mercy, but now have received mercy." And that's exactly what I was talking about, is as we go into that light, we are seeing firsthand God's mercy. And, you know, when you look around at all the various Sabbath congregations, a lot of times those people would have no interaction with each other in a real world setting. But it's the thing that brings us together is the pursuit of God's way. The Sabbath, trying to live our lives accordingly. There are many things in this life that we can complain about, but God opening our eyes doesn't need to be one of them. Because as our eyes are open, we live. As our lives are growing as living sacrifices, there is one thing that becomes more and more evident. And that's as we grow and walk in the light, and we are exposed to more things, and we flip more tables in our life, we're exposed to just how great God's mercy is. So hopefully this is something that encourages you, helps you to continue in that pursuit of going into God's light, and hopefully it's something that you can use to catapult you into further studies.